Well, thank you, Dr. Whyte, for taking some time to speak with us. If you wouldn't mind, just for our audience, just introducing yourself briefly and telling us just a little bit about your work and background.
My name is Kyle Whyte, and I'm a professor in the philosophy department at Michigan State University, and I've been there since 2009. I'm an ethicist and environmental philosopher, and I'm an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. I'm primarily interested in working on issues of climate ethics and climate justice in relation to indigenous people like my own tribe. And I focus a lot of my work in the Great Lakes region, but I also look to international concerns as well with indigenous peoples.
So the reason we invited you here, part of the reason we invited you here today, besides the fact that you're a great guy, we like spending time with you, is that you're here to speak for the Rock Research Ethics Lecture Series. So we've asked our previous guests if there are particular ethical issues that you identify as important in contemporary research ethics. And the event you're here for around genetically modified organisms is sort of at the fringe of research ethics, but if you could speak to a little bit about what you see as important in research ethics.
In the world of climate ethics and climate justice relating to indigenous people, research ethics is a huge area because indigenous people are interacting more and more with climate scientists, whether they want to in some cases or whether they don't want to in other cases. And that brings up a number of issues about the ethical conduct of climate scientists when they work with indigenous people. And so I work on a lot of issues having to do with whether climate science methods and projects adequately benefit indigenous peoples, whether they pose problematic risks or harms on indigenous people, whether indigenous people get to participate ethically in the development of research, and whether climate science funding programs adequately make it so that indigenous people can direct their own research.
So there seem to be, at least from my perspective, some obvious overlaps between climate justice issues, climate issues, indigeneity issues, and our topic for this discussion on genetically modified organisms. And some of the things, especially around justice issues that you've described, do you see in any way that justice issues are particularly novel in the context of genetic modified organisms, or are they just the application of this sort of standard set of ethical issues from justice to whatever else to this new technology, this emergent technology?
Well, I think that research on genetic modification does bring up a lot of issues that you see in other areas of research ethics in relation to indigenous people. However, I would say that research on genetic modification oftentimes hits very close to home because a lot of indigenous people, like my own tribe, were very concerned with being able to live together with certain plants and animals. And by certain plants and animals, I mean the same plants and animals that our people have lived with for hundreds and hundreds of years. And if research on genetic modification could lead to the implementation or commercial implementation of certain new animals and plants into the environment, and if that affects the plants and animals that a lot of native people have lived with for so long, then that's a pretty serious issue. Another face of that issue that I think it also hits very close to home is that native people, in response to settler colonialism, have had to overcome all sorts of challenges and hurdles, and still today it's very difficult to assert our nationhood in the face of settler states like the US or Canada. So a lot of tribes are trying to develop their own economies and trying to strengthen their political structures and so on. And with a lot of different tribes, I see them engaging in commercial agriculture and commercial forestry. And if research on genetic modification is done in a way that's not supportive of how tribes want to go about those commercial endeavors, that I do think there are serious ethical issues, right? Because it would seem like the research is supporting the interests of some people, but is not necessarily supporting the interests of tribes.
Right. Yeah. So it seems like from that perspective, there have got to be particular tools and techniques of science that are picked up in potentially novel ways by indigenous communities who are really interested in connection to place and connection to local ecological communities as well. Do any stand out in your mind as tools or techniques of science that have particular application from your perspective?
Well, one thing that I do see with the way in which a lot of indigenous peoples use science is, even if they use scientific methods that on the face of it look like the same thing as what scientists in universities or federal agencies do, oftentimes they're directed at they're directed at very different goals, right? They might be directed at different species. They might be directed at different conceptions of biodiversity. They might include different sources of knowledge, such as indigenous people's traditional knowledge. So I think there's that part of it. But it's also the case, too, that if you're looking at research done by tribes, say agricultural research, then oftentimes you'll see when tribes do that kind of research that they have stronger standards of safety, for example. They have stronger standards for avoiding the possible environmental risks of certain kind of research. Or, for example, they'll favor certain standards like, say, organic standards or locally grown standards or things like that. So oftentimes if you look carefully, you'll see that the way in which tribes engage with fairly ordinary scientific tools and research instruments is a little bit different from how other communities or other organizations or academic institutions do.
Yeah, so relatedly, one of the reasons we're holding this panel discussion in the first place is because we've seen, or we'd like to identify a shift in thinking and scientific work around genetically modified organisms from a focus on food safety to a broader focus on environmental considerations. But from what you'd said, it sounded like that's already sort of on the radar and already a very important part to sort of indigenous thought as it relates to genetic modification and the practices of science.
For indigenous people with genetic modification, the environmental dimensions of it are huge, and they have been for some time. So take, for example, the case of wild rice. So for the nation that I'm part of, the broader nation and cultural group, the Anishinaabe, wild rice has been one of the key plants that our culture and lifestyle is based on. In fact, in our creation story, we were told to stop migrating from the east when we arrived at the land where food grows on water, so wild rice. And in treaties and other agreements, Anishinaabe people made sure that they had access to what we call in the English language naturally growing wild rice. And the University of Minnesota, for example, has been interested in doing research on genetic modification of rice. I don't believe they're doing that much research anymore, but a few years back it was something that they were interested in. And tribes in the Great Lakes region were extremely concerned that that research would promote variations of rice that would eventually take over the rice that Anishinaabe people choose to harvest, and that would have a huge environmental impact on Anishinaabes' ability to continue our cultures. And so there you have a huge environmental issue associated with research on genetic modification. I'm also aware of other issues fairly recently about commercial forestry and about genetic modification research on forest products. A lot of tribes are forest tribes, including my own group, Anishinaabe, and a form of research that might lead to eventual environmental implications, such as the changing of the kind of biodiversity that tribal ways of life depend on for continuing their cultures and for subsisting. That's a huge environmental issue. And so there's a lot of concerns, I think, in Indian country and with indigenous people broadly about kind of the environmental impacts or the environmental implications of research on genetic modification.
Yeah, so the wickedness, if you will, of a problem like this has, with all its environmental and social implications, obviously has direct policy implications as well. So as a faculty member, especially working with graduate students, what connection do you see between the sort of professionalization of young graduate students and a connection to policy orientation in research?
A lot of the doctoral students that I work with at my institution, but also outside of my institution, they really want to be engaged in research, whether it's scientific research or humanistic research that benefits communities, and that actually they can see the impact and that they developed the research so that it was properly tailored to support what communities need most with respect to different issues, whether it's climate change or natural resources or food sovereignty. The thing that a lot of graduate students get caught up in, and I do my best and spend a lot of time doing this to kind of guide them through this obstacle course they face when they realize that the funders, the people that design the structure of research programs, oftentimes really either they don't even think about what a community might be able to get out of research. They don't, or they don't involve the community at all, or they just don't have access to the perspectives of community members. And so for me, it's very important to work with doctoral students in a way that they recognize those differences between what the people that design funding programs for research want and what communities want, and to help build in doctoral students those skill sets they need to actually collaborate with communities to develop participatory research. And in my world, we actually call this indigenous research methodology, which is similar to participatory research. So I think it's key that graduate students are prepared with the basics of participatory research as a matter of ethics so that they can ensure that the communities that need the benefits of research most actually can have those benefits.
So this might be, this next question might be directly related, in fact, but we've asked all our guests to sort of offer one piece of advice that you might offer to young graduate students in the sciences about the importance of ethics or the role of ethics in their work. So if you could offer one piece of advice to graduate students, what might it be?
The one piece of advice that I have for graduate students is that you need to always be thinking about what is it that's going to fulfill you most about the scientific and other work that you might be doing, and to really think carefully about this idea that actually there's a lot of fulfillment involved in doing research that is designed in collaboration with communities that will benefit from that work. And oftentimes graduate students are pushed in another direction where they get farther and farther away from those communities, and they forget about that importance, or they become calloused, or they just become too distant from it. So I really think that one place in which ethics starts is always reminding yourself that one of the reasons why you got into doing science, or why your scientific work is important, even if you got into it for another reason, is that it can directly benefit communities and support them in their struggles and in better understanding the issues that affect them, and to always be reminding yourself of whether you're conducting yourself in a way that will be eventually beneficial to the communities that you're concerned with.
That seems particularly relevant in the context of genetic modification, since communities are the ones who are directly impacted by its implementation. That seems really.
Yeah, I agree.
Dr. Whyte, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks
All right,
for
great.
talking with me.
Thank you.